Hey everyone. The first part of this talk was a little bit glitchy, so I've re recorded the talk. Um, I want to say that I'm very thankful to the Asiatic Society for allowing me to do this, and it's been a real pleasure to be part of the Asiatic Society MRC group. And without further ado, let's start the talk. Um, my goal today is to sort of give you an idea of the early history of Bombay theatres through the medium of film ephemera. A lot of information can be gleaned from this film ephemera, which is actually collected by my grandfather um, in the early part of the 20th century when he came to Bombay as an Iranian immigrant. He used to work in Irani cafes, and he ended up going to a lot of theaters and collecting film ephemera. So this ephemera basically has come down through the family. Fortunately, I'm not the the one that's had to collect all of this, but from this we can get an idea of the early history of film and cinema in India and how it progressed. So we have a bit of history to get to first, following which we will progress through the historical evolution of theaters in Bombay and how those theaters eventually became cinemas. So without much ado, let's begin the talk. So here is the sort of um, setting the stage part of it. Now, when you come to pre-cinema entertainment stages, there was no such thing as a built theater. There was no built heritage. There was no tangible heritage. Theaters were, by their nature, temporary and ephemeral. When you go back to the earliest Sanskrit sources, there is barely any description of the construction of or the existence of theaters. We have very few sources, in fact, that actually tell us what a play was looking like in those days. We have regional variants which have descended from that. You have, Jatra and Kathakali and Kudiyatam, and these are sort of like the closest equivalents we have to descendants from early pre-cinema Sanskritic theater. Um, when you come to the stages that were used uh, in folk theater traditions, each stage had a very temporary structure. You had a wooden platform or some sort of raised platform. In Bhavai in Gujarat, they do not even have that. You are amidst the audience or surrounded by the audience. And eventually, what happens is they come, they set up the stage, you perform, and then the stage is taken down and dismantled. And then the next day, there is absolutely no trace that a theater or a performance stage ever existed at that point. So a Jatra stage, which still exists, this is a modern picture that you can see on camera, but a Jatra stage basically is similar to what would have been early pre-cinema performances. Um, the actor or the player sort of enters the audience. There is no wing. You get onto the stage from the audience and they perform on the stage and then sort of get off the stage similarly. In Bhavai as well, similar sort of audience surrounded participation happens. So whether it is in different traditions across India, you see the same sort of basic structure, which is that structures were temporary, structures could be dismantled, and there is no actual trace or record of these structures. So we cannot say with any certainty what was or wasn't a stage or a theater in these sort of pre-cinema times. When the Portuguese came by to colonize and sort of make a life for themselves in India. They introduced the idea of mystery plays, or plays that were linked to the life of Christ. Mystery plays or morality plays are very crucial here because they are our first sort of recorded performance of what we know as a play in our sort of society. Mystery plays sort of were usually performed around festivals of Lent or Easter and so on. And, the Jesuits would teach them in Latin to perform. And the entire play was performed in Latin about the life of Christ. These plays were really crucial because eventually what happened was that these kind of plays, or the mystery plays around the life of Christ, uh, eventually, in fact, went on to become influential when Dadasaheb Phalke saw a film and then went on to make his own film inspired by a mystery play, which was about the crucifixion of Christ. So these sort of performances are our first recorded performances of plays. And they were used pretty much across all Portuguese territories in India. The earliest documented evidence of a performance was in Goa. And you have this very influential playwright and poet called Luis de Camões. I hope I'm pronouncing this right. This sort of recorded performance of the play was in 1555. Luis de Camões was a very interesting individual. I would urge everyone to sort of get up there and sort of, look him up, because as an individual, he's sort of like the poet laureate or the Shakespeare of Portugal. And he presented a play called the Auto de Filodemo, which was performed in Goa in 1555. This performance was for the governor of Goa. So you not only have sort of religious theater, you have sort of playwrights coming and introducing new plays within Goa for the people to perform and enjoy as an audience. So already we are starting to see a culture that is sort of getting educated in how to consume various forms of entertainment. This is Luis de Camões. He didn't have one eye. So as you can see, he lived a very adventurous and eventful life. This is the Auto de Filodemo page that you can see out here. It was one of the first printed documents, in fact, to come out of Goa. So very influential to the growth of theater and then eventually the growth of cinema in India. Now, when the British came to India, you have the early settlers of the East India Company. Entertainment for them meant dance halls, of course, and amateur theatrical performances that could be put up from the soldiers in the cantonment. Various dinners given at the houses of various senior officials or higher ranking officials. And of course, very importantly, Nach performances, which was sort of the approved courtly entertainment. Here in the picture, you can see the Sindhya Maharaja entertaining the British resident with a Nach performance. And Nach girls, of course, were very much in demand because, eventually the British also sort of came to adopt this as a sort of higher courtly form of entertainment. And for a great many centuries afterwards, you had the Nach performer earning her livelihood by giving performances primarily for and consumed by white audiences. In the next few pictures, you will see Edwin Lord Weeks, who was a white artist, European artist, painting his sort of idea of a Nach performance. It's unclear whether he witnessed it firsthand or this was a description that was given to him. And on the left, you can see, sorry, on the right, you can see a Nautch girl sort of twirling in front of an audience of white people. So in both cases, you have Europeans, one who is painting a picture, but there is no European person within the audience. And then in the other one, you can clearly see European people within the audience. So it is a rather curious sort of setup in which, you know, the native performers knew that their performances were consumed and appreciated primarily by the other races. Now, when the first theater was set up, this is our first recorded, sort of our first recorded factual evidence of a theater that is a building specifically for the purpose of being a playhouse. It seems to have existed in the first Fort William plans that we see in 1753. This theater is a very strategic theater because its location right outside the Fort William walls allowed it to be a base from which Siraj-ud-Daulah attacked Fort William. And of course, in the siege of Calcutta, this theater was crucial when Siraj-ud-Daulah imprisoned a bunch of Europeans and consigned them to the Black Hole tragedy of Calcutta. Again, I'm not about to get into military history, but the siege of Calcutta basically hinged on the fact that Siraj-ud-Daulah was able to encamp his army so close to the fort. And of course, the theater was a crucial element of that. So in the next slide, you will see these two little red dots on the plans indicate the location of Fort William and the location of the playhouse, which is almost in a direct line to them. This playhouse was destroyed once the siege, sort of was over in the fighting. It had been badly damaged, and in its earliest form, it no longer existed. Then, of course, later on, this playhouse was rebuilt, which you can see in the image on the right-hand side. But it's unclear at what point it was rebuilt. And this painting was, of course, made many years after the fact. So we do not have any records as to when exactly this playhouse was sort of re-engineered from its ruins again. In the meantime, with Bombay had been transferred over to the British, and Bombay came under the British. So let's have a bit of Bombay history first, then I will tell you about the Bombay theater that was set up in between the destruction of the first theater ever in India and the second theater to come up in Calcutta. So the marriage of Charles II to Catherine of Braganza, almost everybody knows. It is crucial in Bombay history because it transferred Bombay from a Portuguese dominion to a British dominion. Charles gave Bombay over to the East India Company because post his marriage, he could not actually assert control over Bombay thanks to the Portuguese sort of waffling over when to hand over power to him. Bombay was finally given to the East India Company on 27 March 1668 at a yearly rent of £10 payable to the Crown. And Charles in return received £50,000 as a loan from the East India Company. So the East India Company thought it was a pretty good bargain because they'd been looking for a spot on the Konkan coast. They were not very happy with Surat. And they had their eyes on Bombay for a while, so they were quite happy to take it over. And then they set about building a set of buildings and infrastructure that would allow them to conduct company business within Bombay, and also to live and exist and enjoy life as they had in, England. So Bombay sort of became part of that grand plan and the great project to make an Urbs Prima, the first city, Urbs Prima in Indus, the first city of India. Of course, this is the photo of Charles and Catherine. I I don't know whether they look happily or unhappily married, but this is their marriage portrait. So this is sort of the crucial catalyzing event that eventually turned Bombay into a center. Now, having acquired Bombay, the British were very keen to develop it. They invited many communities to come and settle in Bombay. These communities make up what has become known as the cosmopolitanism of Bombay. They, introduced many sort of activities for their officers, leisure parties, dinners, balls, dances, hunts. There were several, fox hunts and such attempts to make entertainment sort of available to the people here. And of course, in all of these efforts, the British added a theatre in the mid-1770s to Bombay Green. So what you now know as Horniman Circle is only a small part of what was once a very much larger area called Bombay Green. And the theatre used to be located on one side of the Bombay Green. The theatre was built by public subscription, which means people put up money to build it. And it was enjoyed by a variety of people. Here you can see here you can see one of the first sort of images of the theatre. The theatre is the building on the right of the image. So this big building in the corner that seems to have a few men with palanquins around it, that used to be the theatre. And it was very much in use, but unfortunately, the kind of performances that could be put up there were only amateur performances. So for a long time, performances in this space were very peripatetic. You had amateur companies made up of, people living in Bombay who would decide to put up a play, but of course they could not make the schedules work. So in order to have a long running play, you have to have regular schedules, like a performance at 6 o'clock on Wednesday or so on and so forth. These amateur companies obviously were staffed by volunteers, so they could not make the schedules work for them. So for a long time, these, play performances, even though they were very encouraged by the sort of population in Bombay, the theatre wasn't making any profits. It was in fact going at a deep loss. And it was also getting significantly run down as is the nature of things. And it was decided that it would be parceled up and sold off. But in the meantime, this is the sort of interiors that the very first Bombay theatre had, the Bombay Green Theatre, as we know it. Here you can see the entertainment given to Charles Forbes in the theatre in Bombay on the night of 16th October 1811. So you can see that there is quite a bit of decoration here. They seem to have made a good effort, and there seems to be some sort of dinner going on. But it looks rather lavish, and they've made a good effort and a good job of it. It's a pity that it no longer exists, because I think it would have been nice to visit it and see it. Somehow I feel, going back to the previous slide, it reminds me a lot of Asiatic, but it's not Asiatic. It's a completely separate building, which was destroyed. This is a tent set up for a bobbery hunt. Now, the reason I've included this is that this tent setup will become extremely important later on, when you'll have tent sort of entrepreneurs camping in Maidans and trying to run bioscope shows later on, once cinema makes its advent, because the tent setups are almost exactly like this. They would have, Maidans, and those Maidans would be allocated for a particular period of time, and they would set up the tent, run the shows a couple of times a day. and then decamp and move on. And that's how they made money. There are a number of early entrepreneurs of cinema who basically got all their wealth in this way. So this is just to give you an idea of like how the tents looked. This is another theater that I found in my research, which somehow doesn't find any mention anywhere else. It seems to be some sort of military military setup that was just temporary or only existed within the barracks. But the first-hand account that he gives us, someone is drawing on the screen. The first-hand account that he gives us of this sort of setup is very interesting because it reads, the most popular form of entertainment even back then in 1819 was the theater. The officers built this theater by themselves, and they sort of also drew the acting talent from within their own ranks. So a very interesting sort of aftermath to this is that they didn't have enough female performers, because back then women wouldn't perform, you would have men doing female roles. So they used their cannoneers as the female performers. Of course, all the cannoneers had bulging biceps, so it wasn't a very successful performance, I think. But it's very interesting that these little details find their way into, you know, our current era, and we can read them and look back on it and sort of think about how people back then lived and, you know, enjoyed theater the same way that we do, I guess. So by 1836, the Bombay Theatre that you saw previously was completely defunct. It had become really dilapidated. They tried renovating it. It didn't work. It was going in a loss. As you can see, the figures are all listed here. So they decided to cut their losses and sort of sell it and use the surplus money that they received to set up a central public library and other sort of public works. So by 1836, Bombay really didn't have a permanent theater building anymore. This is the theater building that was pulled down. So now this is the only sort of idea we have of how it used to look. It does not exist anymore. There's another description on 22nd January 1840. This very wealthy man, Goan Christian, Salsette Christian, it's a bit unclear, but he celebrated his daughter's wedding with 2 theatrical performances within his own house. Remember that I told you that if you were rich, you could afford to invite theater troupes over and just have them perform and call all your friends over and also watch it. So this was attended by 200 plus people, Europeans, the Nawab of Mazgaon, and Kasetji Jamshedji, who wrote about it. Of course, after, you know, sort of enjoying these entertainments at this fellow's daughter's wedding, this sort of gave rise in the minds of people that, you know, it's 1840. There already were 4 years by which they didn't have any theater.
Sorry to interrupt you. Whoever's drawing on screen, please don't do that. That's not at all civil.
There is some Meenal who is doing that. Please stop doing it. We can see your name as you scribble. Please stop doing that. You're disturbing the entire lecture.
So anyway, so people realized that they kind of missed having a theater, and they wanted a theater, and they sort of did like the signature campaign. As I said in the preview, that this is the very first change.org petition that we have of this kind of thing, where people sort of asked around and said, hey, do you want a theater? We also want a theater. Let's do a signature campaign. And this signature campaign was circulated in the Asiatic libraries. So we have record of it. And also if you want to go back to the primary source, Teresa Albuquerque mentions it in her book, Herbs Prima in Indus. So you can go back and check if you'd like to sort of track down the original source of this. This is, we don't know which building, but it says the inside of the grand illuminated temporary building on the Esplanade, Bombay at night, 20th of May, 1811. So it's a temporary building. However, we can see it's pretty grand. There's a lovely lavish chandelier hanging. There's a curtain hanging. There are pillars, but it's still temporary. It looks like people are dancing or just generally mingling with each other. And so this seems like some sort of, ball or like a dinner dance sort of thing. However, it's unclear what exactly this was supposed to be for. The earlier picture had a clear inscription that said this was for the farewell of a certain person. But in this, we do not know what this sort of dinner, dance, entertainment that's happening. What is it for? We have no idea. But I thought it was interesting to include because this temporary building gives us an idea that if they chose to, they could manufacture very beautiful things for their own entertainments. So again, this is 1811. Now we come to Grant Road Pillar House, as people know. It wasn't always called Pillar House. The name Pillar House comes from play house, which then eventually became corrupted to Pillar House. The Grant Road Theatre was built on land donated by Jagannath Sankarseth, and he basically put up most of the money for it. It opened on the 10th February 1846, and they tried to fill this void that they have with regards to like the lack of a proper theatre in Bombay. Unlike the other theatre at Bombay Green, this was in the heart of native town, as it was called back then, because by this time the fort area was predominantly European, and then you had like the natives living outside the fort walls. So this theatre set up in native town, however, did have European entertainments and did cater to Europeans, but very crucially, it also did allow a number of vernacular theatre groups to perform, which was crucial in the rise of Marathi literature and plays and Parsi Natak theatre, which we will come to. But up until the 1850s, it didn't really do that well because a lot of Europeans was sort of reluctant to go over to the native town, and they tried to sort of promote it, but it really didn't pick up that much. It was only once American and European performers started doing the international world circuit and using Bombay as a stopping point that this theater really picked up in business. Before that, it wasn't doing that well. So this is a double-edged knife because it has a good side where, because it wasn't doing well, they gave it to local Natak Mandalis and local performances, amateur performances, which gave rise to Parsi Natak. But it was bad because Grant Road Theatre didn't last very long either. Pillar House sort of switched hands and was running losses and had to be constantly infused with cash. It was a very, very cash sucking kind of. Oops. So as the English drama sort of failed at the Grant Road Theatre, the vernacular company started to gain popularity, as I said. The Parsi Natak Mandali was established in 1853. Farangji Dalal was the proprietor. And of course, you have the grand sort of landmark event of staging their first Parsi Natak drama, Rustam and Saurabh, at the Grand Pro Theatre, which is crucial because Parsi Natak developed a very unique sort of form within this space that they had carved out of themselves. It was this mix of European performance, and it used local vernacular Gujarati sort of performers. And eventually it also started to bring in Urdu writers and started to adopt stories from Hindu mythology, but at the same time kept it very secular. So you have a very unique setup when it comes to Parsi Natak. Another unique setup here was the Hindu Dramatic Corps. Yeah. They actually, it's a very interesting story. You had, drama companies who would sort of come with their own curtains because it was that sort of tiny, like in terms of operations, and they would perform at these theaters. And, you had modern Marathi plays arising in 1843. You had Vishnudas Bhave act in Sita Swayamvar, which was performed in Sangli, not in Bombay. But then, as you can see, Vishnudas Bhave brought a number of other plays to Bombay, which were highly recommended even by the European journalists at the time. So you have the emergence of like this marriage of Yakshagana theatre and Sangeet Natak eventually arising from it. Marathi theatre really sort of flourished in this sort of era and period, theatre as well as tamasha. You really had a good synthesis of the Sanskrit and the Western traditions. And surprisingly, this tradition was unchallenged until the 1930s. Like until the talkies came around, you still had a hardcore fan audience coming to watch these sort of performances. And of course, in these vernacular performances, they would have a serious sort of play, and then they would have like some song or some sort of, light farcical play, a comedy to leave in the thing. So you didn't just have one performance, you had a number of performances that were sort of scheduled by the theatre troupe in that particular night. What is really interesting is now when you come to these booklets, you start to see Gujarati lettering, but there are ghazal songs and poetry inside. And these were sort of the earliest extant versions of film booklets. You have, as you can see over here, this lady, pin-up girls on top. But a lot of these ghazals are about adapted sort of Sufi lyrics that were made into lovers' complaints and lovers' poems and ghazals that were about ashik and dard and everything like that. I'll try to find another one. Yes. This one, as you can see, says Darde Dil in Gujarati, but it's still using an Urdu idiom.
Sharon, can you temporarily stop sharing your screen? Then we can see you full screen. Otherwise, we see you as a thumbnail.
Okay. Wait 1 second. Is that like?
Yes.
So as you can see, all of you who can read Gujarati, this says Darde Dil, although it's reversed. But you also have like a very interesting looking Apsara-ish lady on top. And this trend sort of continues with the early Bombay sort of booklets. You have this one which says Natija-e-Sharab, all right, and you have her like this. All right. I don't know what she's doing with that bottle on her head, but here you go. And so I think this is supposed to be some sort of polemic, moralizing play, because it says Natija-e-Sharab, and then at the back it shows you, I guess, a couple of drunk men. And here you see the lettering in Urdu, whereas in front it is in, whereas in front it is in Gujarati. So it's a very interesting sort of syncretic tradition that we have in Bombay theatre and cinema already, where you have, you know, here you see side by side juxtaposed Urdu lettering at the bottom. I'm sorry, I can't really twist this too much because this will fall apart in my hands, but if you can make out, and this is entirely in Gujarati. So you can see that, you know, Urdu, Gujarati, sometimes even English, as you will see later, all existed side by side. And it gives you a pretty good picture of like what the cultural makeup and the audience preferences were, the kind of people who would attend these things. This one, interestingly, includes the publisher. So this was published in Ahmedabad and then brought to India. And we see what is clearly like a Nautch girl looking person on top. And it says, Aashikon ki dard. I think Aashikon ki Eid. I'm not sure. My Gujarati is very rusty. But, and then as usual, they include.
It's Eid.
Here you have a Kawal that is listed in Gujarati. So this is Kawal right here. So a very, very interesting sort of, here you have a ghazal, if you can read that. So a lot of these were handed out to sort of occupy people in between performances as the performers changed, or whether they had like some, I think this is, I have no idea what this says, frankly, but she looks very active up here on the cover. Again, you can see the Orientalist trend, the Nautch girl trend sort of coming forth in this sort of imagery that's used to sell these things, because not a single one of them, apart from one, which I will show you, has a man on it. They are all women, and sort of like these were the earliest versions of pin-up girls in Indian cinema. You have your item girls, like these were the original item girls. We don't even know their names. Yeah, this is the only one with a man, but he is also romancing a woman who seems to be very uninterested in him, surprisingly. As you can see, it lists kawals that it has within the listing. And Gujarati on top, Urdu at the bottom. Some very interesting design choices. Here we have what seems to be one of the very first political pamphlets handed out. I have tried to track it. It's not easy, but it seems that this gentleman was an early proponent of the Khilafat movement and passed these pamphlets out as sort of political propaganda. That's why it just has him on it. But I'm not really sure what exactly he hoped to achieve by passing these out, because only the front is like just only the front is his diatribe against the British. It's like one of the earliest things that I've read with regards to the freedom movement. You'll see independence related imagery come up in later booklets, but you know, this is the first that I have seen amongst the older ones. As I said, this gentleman was probably linked to the Khilafat movement. I've tried to find out who he is, but I have no idea. You also see for the first time English on the cover. A couple more and then we'll sort of continue onwards on our journey. 1 second. There we are. This is a very, very classic looking cover. It's like almost Mughal in its design and style. But you see, it says Jame Kosar, I think. And I don't know if that makes sense. This is also a little bit damaged. But as you can see, it's a super Mughal looking kind of design on top with flowers around this very royal lady. Anyway, carrying on. So we did this. Sorry, am I sharing? One second. My computer is incredibly slow today, so I'm just sort of trying to reshare the screen. Give me a second. Yes. So now Parsi theatre, as I said, I promised to get to it. Parsi theatre basically stems from the Parsis. They migrated from the coast of Gujarat in Western India, and they migrated in the 8th century. And by the 19th century, you had many Parsis who were holding important positions within the government of Bombay. So this is just a small background to the Parsi sort of community. Now, the first Parsi Elphinstone Dramatic Club was founded by a Parsi student, okay, Kunwarji Sorabji Nazir at the Elphinstone College. And the club performed plays twice a week. They did one in English at the college, and then they did one at Grand Road Theatre. We do not know what language those were in. This club later came to be known as the Elphinstone Theatre Company, which was later taken over by Jamshedji Famji Madan. Now, an interesting thing about the Elphinstone Theatre is that it still exists. One second. It is the new Roshan Talkies, which you will see later on in the presentation. It has survived in a very poor state, but the way it has survived is incredible because you have something that was created and sort of theater performances were happening and then evolved into like a cinema theater and sort of still kind of is hanging in there when so many other theaters have given up the ghost. So it's an incredibly interesting story. And this, of course, was taken over by Famji Madan in his bid to expand his cinema empire. So now, when it came to Parsi performances, you had non-Parsis vastly outnumbering the Parsis, as is the case anyway within the population itself. Like the Parsi community is small, but you know, they never sort of discriminated. They allowed people of all faiths to come in and work with them. So you had, you know, different people working in different sort of areas of Parsi Natak theaters. And very crucially, as I said, you will come to see that they were the first to bring in Urdu writers. So a lot of the language of cinema, even now, this very sort of Urdu inflected tone was initially brought in and propagated by Parsi Natak. You have by 1860 over 20 Parsi theatre groups in Bombay. I could go down a whole list, but you know most of it won't really make sense because they don't exist anymore. But what is important is that these Parsi Natak groups spawned interest in eventually what would become cinema and cinema acting, because it all originated here. You had entrepreneurs like Ramji Madan, Jamshedji Ramji Madan come out of Parsi theatre groups and eventually go on to sort of make their own way in exhibiting movies. So, sorry. So you have a great deal of contribution that Parsi theatre has made to Indian film as it exists in this day and age. You have like the aesthetic sensibility that is created through the introduction of Urdu, which like still inflects our songs. All our romantic songs use Urdu words. And Bombay cinema is built upon this sort of melodrama and theatricality. So you had international entertainers, Emma Grattan, who came in 1862. She came via Hong Kong. As I said, a lot of theater troupes and performers would do these around the world tours where they would go to all the British colonies or the colonies set up throughout the world and sort of go from place to place, in spending 3 to 4 years, depending on the profits that they made within a certain area. So Emma Grattan came over from the Far East via Hong Kong, and she did well in Bombay. She actually, there are first-hand accounts that she managed a theater in Bombay for a number of years. And interestingly, she stayed on, made a profit, which was in fact noted later on in like a newspaper report about her that was contemporaneous, saying that she was one of the few that left India with a profit in hand and not with a loss. So that's very crucial because she's a female entrepreneur that we don't really hear about. There's another performer that we need to discuss who is incredibly problematic. Talking about Dave Carson. Dave Carson, did an all India circuit quite a few times. He performed in Calcutta. He performed a bunch of places. He had a certain way of performing that if you're not familiar with it, it's called blackface or brownface, where he being a white man sort of darkened his skin to appear like an Indian and to sort of it wasn't just an Indian though, because he did variations of it. So he did a Parsi gentleman, he did a Bengali babu, and he did a palkiwala, which I'm guessing is one of those palanquin bearers. He also had a separate, distinct act, which was based on Ethiopians in America. And he adapted minstrel songs, which were songs that were sung by minstrel shows. Again, if you're not familiar with minstrel shows are basically these caricatured versions of Black people that use song and performance sort of to show how bumbling they are, maybe. I get that it was a different time and place, and maybe people didn't have like political correctness there. But it strikes me as incredibly funny that Indian audiences enjoyed seeing these caricatures made of themselves. You have contemporaneous accounts that, when he performed in Bombay, he did a thing that included a Parsi sort of gentleman. And we have songs that he sang. And I'll just read the song out because, I don't want to take up too much of the time. But the song goes, as a place of generous people, Bombay, it has the name. One may do good and get surprised to find it fame. With its Gigi boys and Sassoons and others of that run, how many years have been bound to go, the whole hog or none. There is Kawasji Jahangir, he thinks his money is but thrash. On many institutions, he has spent a lot of cash. He ought to be made a baronet for all the good that he's done. And his motto, it should be to go the whole hog or none. Now, it seems a great song on the surface of it, but once you look it up, you realize that the song chorus or the song refrain, the whole hog or none, is a minstrel song that was usually sung by blackface performers in the US. And Dave Carson singing it to Indian audiences dressed as an Indian man was incredibly, I don't know how it makes me feel at this point, because crowds clearly loved it. There was such a push for his performances that people were fighting over seats, and that eventually led to the innovation of like numbering all the seats and passing out number tickets so that you didn't fight other people for seats. So crowds certainly loved it, and I'm sure sensibilities were different then, but it just strikes me as incredibly problematic sitting here in the 21st century to look back on these things and to feel as if maybe Dave Carson was kind of having a laugh at our expense, you know. But anyway. So we come to the invention of cinema. Now the Indian cinema, you know, it has a deep connection with the invention of cinema itself, because the Lumieres, when they gave their first screening, it was in a cafe called the Salon Indien, which was the basement of the Grand Cafe. They had, you know, cafes back then had this like big mania for like decorating things as if they were, you know, Eastern or Middle Eastern vaguely looking. And so the first time ever that a cinema was screened, it was in a place called the Salon Indien. And very soon, in fact, the next year, they brought their, you know, films over to India, and that sort of set off a whole separate arc of people who were influenced by and wanted to make cinema of their own. So we'll come to that. So on 7th July, you have movies coming into Bombay. This fellow called Marius Sestier, I think I'm saying it right, brought over the Lumiere short films to screen in a British hotel called the Watson Hotel. Now, of course, no Indian attended this screening because the Watson Hotel was for Europeans. So at the time, this was only screened for Europeans. The 6 films that were screened that day I have listed out, and they arranged another screening at the Novelty Theatre, which is not the Novelty Theatre we know, a separate one. And 24 films were screened that day. So in this way, they sort of alternated back and forth between, you know, hotels and, you know, theaters, and sort of, you know, gave Indians their first taste of what motion picture cinema was like. Of course, there was still no talkies, so all of this was scored to like music or, you know, a live orchestra band performing as you watch these things. But eventually what happened is a lot of Maharashtrian, a lot of Indian people saw that, wanted to do the same thing, got influenced, and then decided to do it. Even though the Lumiere brothers were quite strictly against leasing their version of film camera out to filmmakers. So the first film to be eventually released in India was Shri Pundalik, a silent Marathi film by Dada Saheb Torne on May 18, 1912. So this was very, very crucial because this film and then this next fellow sort of set the bar for other Indian filmmakers to follow after them. So at the Lumiere film screenings, you had a local photographer called H.S. Bhattavdekar. He was very influenced by this motion picture and really wanted to make some himself. So he wrote to London to send him a film, a film camera back for 21 guineas. And then he made the film, and then he sent back the film to develop to London, because back then there were no sort of processing facilities here. He put in an incredible amount of effort in shooting documentary films. They were not very long, but he was one of the first people to sort of get bitten by the cinema bug and do these things. Subjects like Man and Monkey, which was like just a monkey, like a tamasha guy. The renovation of the Parsi fire temple, Atash Behram 1901. The life of a British Member of Parliament of Parsi Indian origin, the landing of Sir M.M. Bhavnagri 1901. So Bhattacharya lived a very long and, eventful life. He ended up managing the Gaiety Theatre actually. And, he also sort of like played a great hand in encouraging and supporting the rise of cinema in Bombay, basically. So now we come to the 1911 Darbar. The reason why I like to call it the first Indian blockbuster is that there had been two Darbars prior to 1911, but because the, cinema wasn't invented yet, none of this was filmed. However, and also the prior Darbars, the Emperor, Empress, in the case of Victoria, did not come down to Bombay. So it was just the Viceroy that was acting on behalf of the Emperor and the Empress. So in the 1911 Darbar, George V said that he would come to India, which was a big deal. He wanted to be crowned in India. So that was also another important event for which a whole separate crown was made for him and all of that, but we won't get into that. He genuinely believed in the pomp and the pageantry and the respect that was due to him. And so he did give out sort of permission to film to certain film and cinema companies because he wanted this recorded for posterity. He was very sort of concerned about his legacy and the way he was portrayed. So immediately when he landed in Bombay, this is why the gateway was built, although it was not built when they landed. So eventually what ended up happening was that they just erected some pillars and, had him walk up the ramp from the boat and built this little like Taj Mahal looking kind of dome shaped thing instead of what we now know as the Gateway of India. When they arrived in Bombay, there were 5 British film companies that had already been here waiting for him to arrive so that they could film the exact moment he stepped on the shores of India and walked down the grand procession and, listened to speeches and went on parades and inaugurated the Royal Opera House. So all of these companies had sent their sort of camera crews already to India. And what was very important is that like other companies had about 2 people managing the camera. This fellow called Charles Urban, who's a great pioneer. I wish we had enough time to go into all the biographies, but we don't. But if you want to look up his biography, he is a genius. He invented a whole different kind of camera. And he had a team of 7 or 8 people, out of which 4 were definitely trained cameramen. So, it's a great achievement that he had the foresight to say that, no, I will need more than 2 people to cover this incredibly, crucial event, because there are no do-overs when the king is on parade, right? Like you can't ask the king to like walk past another time. He also had the foresight to shoot black and white film, but experimental color film, which is something called kinemascope with a K. And this experimental color film, we cannot see it in true color because you can only see it in true color when it is projected. You cannot see it in negative form. It can only then be hand colored in an approximate color. So this kinemascope film existed. And then eventually everything except a couple of reels were lost. But when they were exhibited abroad, they caused a sensation. We will come to this. So as I said, we covered this bit where he decided that he was going to shoot 2 kinds of films, one black and white and one in color. He, unusually for that time, because keep in mind in that era, films were barely a couple of minutes long, he decided he would organize his color footage into a 2.5-hour extravaganza program. And that was the first time someone had decided that they were going to make a film of that length, and that to color experimental film. So this was quite an achievement. The film is called With Our King and Queen Through India. And there were about 4 to 5 reels of it. We are not really sure what happened to the others. Only a few survive, like a few sort of reels survive in a Russian archive. They survived because they were mislabeled as World War II reels or World War I reels. And so someone thought that they were footage of the war when it was just the military sort of parading past the king. So that's the only extant Darbar footage that we have of this amazingly popular film. So this was exhibited at the Scala Theatre and King George and Queen Mary visited to watch the film. A bunch of people, dukes, duchesses. This was the first time that cinema was seen as something aspirational that you did. You're going to watch royalty. And, the Scala Theatre was sort of set up to look like the Taj Mahal, meaning the screen was created within this paper kind of mock-up of the Taj Mahal that sat around it. So it was this very grand scale promotional thing that Charles Urban thought up. The music was composed for it, especially to sound like exactly the military bagpipes and the fanfares that you would have heard at the Darbar itself. You had, just amazing promotional efforts. I believe the British Library to this day has a sort of cutout which says like, see the Darbar as if you were looking through this hole yourself, and there's like a Sardar with like a hole in his eye kind of looking at you. But the idea was that what you see in reality was what that color film would look like. It would look almost as if you were there and you did not have to spend money on a ticket to India for it. Now we come to Hiralal Sen. He was a very troubled soul. He was one of the first people who decided that he was going to make films that were based on theater plays. So this is not documentary films. This is not news footage film. This is like the Calcutta theater plays filmed as if you were sitting in the audience at the play. And he purchased a Charles Urban bioscope, and he and his brother founded a bioscope company. Unfortunately, Hiralal Sen himself couldn't keep up with the market pressures. His company eventually ended up folding, and his films were lost because where the warehouse that his films were stored in caught fire. It was his brother's warehouse and it caught fire. And so we have now no record of his films, even though his films predate, Dadasaheb Phalke, but also he is the only Indian to have filmed the Darbar. No other Indian has filmed the Darbar. His films were very well received. You can read a review written right here. And he eventually, not just like he didn't just film what was on the stage. He started adding his own sort of mix to it, and decided to direct his actors like, no, you stand this way and face that way. So in that sense, it's also like the very first start of like film direction efforts. He decided to do Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. Again, we are coming back to Orientalist trends. Sorry. again, we are going back to Orientalist trends, but back then they didn't see it as Orientalist. We can only look at it as Orientalist from our point of view in the 21st century. So this was more sort of popular literature at the time. Everyone knew the Arabian Nights story. Everyone related to the Arabian Nights story. And so he shot a version of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. By 1913, he had closed his business down, sold all his equipment. He was diagnosed with cancer, and he died. Okay, this I do not need to talk to you about. D.G. Phalke is obviously known as the pioneer of Indian cinema. He fused elements from Sanskrit plays into, Hindi vernacular sort of mythos. What's really interesting is that he was inspired to do this after watching a passion play. Remember, I was telling you about mystery plays and passion plays that the Portuguese made the Indians do in Latin, which were focused around the life and death of Christ. By this time, there was already sort of film versions of that. You had passion plays based around the life and death of Christ, and you showed like a Christ figure sort of suffering on the cross. And Phalke had actually gone to see one of these, and he was very moved by it. And he said, we need to do something like this for Indian cinema and for Indian ethos, which is where he got the idea to do Raja Harishchandra. And he introduced, various special effects, various cinema camera tricks. He learned how to use a bioscope by first going to London and learning from, European men. And eventually he bought all the equipment and brought it back to India and started experimenting with it. His first film was like the stop motion plant growing that looked like the plant has grown in 2 minutes, because every day he would just set the shutter sort of to go off. And it was incredible because this movie that he made, Raja Harishchandra, was positioned and marketed. Again, we see the influence of film marketing and film positioning very early on in Indian cinema, because even though there had been other Indians who had made films, Phalke was specifically positioned and marketed towards the viewing audience as a Swadeshi, fully Indian, the first Indian, to make something like this. And it really caught on like wildfire. There was a lot of interest in it. Other people decided to do versions of it. Madan decided to film another similar version of Harishchandra himself eventually. So you have this incredible influence that comes from person to person to person. We can track this journey from theater through, very early cinema efforts, and then now into mainstream cinema, where you have Phalke making Raja Harishchandra, and then eventually Madan will make Harishchandra himself, and you will have Indra Sabhas that were originally plays, which then eventually become Indra Sabha, talking, dancing performances, cinematic performances themselves. So here we come to the man himself. He was sort of the bigwig, the great entrepreneur of Indian cinema. He got his start in Parsi Natak, and that's where he cut his teeth. And it decided eventually that he was going to put together sort of these, production companies, although there wasn't such a word for it at the time. But he was very clear on the fact that he wanted to make not just a theater troupe, but he wanted to make the entire infrastructure start to bottom. So he hired directors, he bought theaters or built theaters and set up theaters. He identified markets, he identified competitors. So he was a very sort of forward-thinking man in terms of the potential of Indian cinema. And that is actually where I would like to leave you, because he was the person that a lot of later filmmakers looked up to in terms of influence and sort of ambition, the way someone would look up to like an important business figure now in this day and age and say, oh, I really am an admirer or a fan of this man. A lot of later filmmakers that came looked at Madan theaters and the Madan sort of empire as inspiration and wanted to do something like that themselves. So this is where we stop for the historical part of it. Now we will come to the fun bit, which is, so these kind of booklets are called ephemera, which is basically just, because they're made out of paper, they're ephemeral. They can tear, they can get wet, they get damaged, as a lot of mine have, frankly. These ephemera, the story behind them is that they were collected by my grandfather, and they date from like the late 20s through the 30s into the 40s. And that's where they stopped because, you know, World War II broke out and a lot of these things weren't being produced or made anymore, in fact. You do have a few sort of wartime films, but they are very few and far between. The majority of them date to the 30s and the mid 30s. Let me pull up one. So what you are seeing on screen, hold on one second, is I can look at it. Okay. So because my grandfather used to be, you know, handling like a Irani cafe, both sides, like both my grandparents were involved in the Irani cafe business. The cafes and hanging around the cafes were crucial for grabbing hold of customers, theater customers, because usually these cafes were located very close to theater districts and or important theaters themselves. So you had a bunch of Irani cafes in the Fort area, and then you had a bunch of Irani cafes within the sort of Grant Road, greater area of Grant Road and Gurgaon. So they would, you know, sort of pass out the booklets or leave the booklets on the counter of Irani cafes, and for people to pick up the way you would do at a cinema theater today. In fact, it hasn't really changed the technology of it. But this is an unfolded one, and it's incredibly delicate. So this is Wadia Movietone presents Pahadi Kanya. You see the reverse of it on your screen, and this is the obverse of it. So you see Nadia sort of being positioned as this mountain girl. I don't know if you can see it right here. We go. And this includes the sort of film distributor at the back. So these things give us big clues as to how films were distributed at the time. It says Best Films Exchange, Peshawar and Delhi. So, you know, you know that it was distributed through these distributors in these cities. And that's very crucial when you come to like the sort of ecology and ecosystem of how a film is produced and released, because it's not enough to just make a film. You have to release it. You have to release it to the right markets and to the right distributors. And you have, you know, the cast sort of listed on this end. And of course, this is very, obviously very clearly Hindi, but you see Hindi and you see English. The Gujarati and the Urdu has completely disappeared by this time. So it's a very interesting sort of journey that we have taken from the early ones into this. Of course, this is a later sort of version. This is an earlier version. This film is now lost. It is a lost film. We know it existed. but this film is a lost film. It's called Bilwa Mangal. It was released by Madan and Madan Theatres Limited. And it, of course, had your Gujarati and English literature on it, and Hindi at the back maybe. But very interesting to see the taglines are already coming in the promotional literature saying, the first colossal 100% Indian talkie in natural color, featuring Nisar Kajan, that is Kajan Bai, who was this extremely influential artist. She was the original pin-up girl of the era. I will show you a few more sort of pin-ups that feature her. Patience Cooper, another incredibly important artist. She's a very powerful and a very popular performer, one of the first sort of female superstars. She eventually ended up going to Pakistan because she married someone there, and then partition happened. But what you see here is at the back, you see the theaters, you see the shows listed, and it's in 2 languages. And you see the way that it's being advertised. Often you will see on these sort of ephemera things, you will see special offers listed, the way you would get like a coupon today in this day and age. You'd see like some of the others say like Nariyal Day special, Coconut Day special. So it's really interesting how these sort of little pieces of paper can give us clues to the entire sort of ecology. And of course, these were just the ones that my granddad got his hands on. I'm sure there were many others which he didn't feel inclined to collect or keep. So they are now lost forever, unfortunately. Let's move on to another one. I think you've all already seen these. Okay. Let's look at it. Yeah. So I already showed you the top one in this image. There is now the original booklet for Indra Sabha as produced by Madan. All right. This is the full booklet, including all the songs. And it includes a future film, upcoming film advertised on the back of it. So this was one of Madan's earlier films. So as you can see, they haven't really moved on to the really nice paper color effects. This still looks like the old style booklets, but it has Kajan on the cover, and she's sort of posing in what is a very scantily clad outfit. I don't know if you can see, especially for that era. And of course, inside you see many other promotional shots. Here you go. Probably a full-sized poster that was sort of printed, and then they reprinted a miniature version of this for the inside of the booklet. So you can see a lot in terms of the fonts that they used, in terms of the imagery that they've used. So very sort of full and maximalist kind of printing. With Kajan and Nisar and scores of beautiful dancers, Madan celestial and gorgeous production, admirable Apsara dances, bee dances, I don't know what a bee dance is, butterfly dances, and other celestial dances. And it says, all singing, all talking, all dancing, Indra Sabha, in 3 languages, right here. So, and of course, all of the songs in Indra Sabha, which were quite a few, the lyrics are all printed here. So just so that you as an audience were not completely lost and didn't have any sort of cluelessness happening. There's a full lyrics printed over here. Every single song. So this is just the Indian sort of performers. I would be very interested in knowing if anyone has any questions up until now. Should I just, how do I check it? Should I stop sharing it?
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you so much. This was indeed a wonderful lecture. We really enjoyed it. It was very, very interesting. And you've got so much of material. I wish that we could have an exhibition later after the pandemic, and we can really have a look into all your material. They're so very interesting. Mumbai Research Center has...
No, I think we can just think about it, Sharon. You know, once the lockdown gets over, we can think about something about having a full exhibition, you know.
Yeah, because you've got so much material and we're all interested in at least seeing them once. So it was really wonderful. We had a wonderful session. Thank you so much. We'll go into the question answers. Actually, Mumbai Research Center has been very, very active for the past few months in conducting a number of programs. And this would be another interesting program which we could have. I would invite Ramesh to tell us a little about the forthcoming Jashn-e-Dastan Mumbai, which Mumbai Research Center is organizing. Meanwhile, I would request the participants to post their questions in the chat box. We'll take up the questions. I invite Ramesh to talk a bit about the Jashn-e-Dastan Mumbai that Mumbai Research Center of Asiatic Society of Mumbai is organizing on the 18th, 19th, and 20th of December.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Quite a few of you would have, I hope, watched the Instagram lives we've been running. Sharon was one of the enthusiastic participants in that, so thank you so much. We've also had quite a lot of other lives. They're all there on our Instagram handle. Our handle is simply named Jashn Mumbai. But we've got quite a lot coming up. I can, let me see if I can show you some of the posters that I made. Can someone see my screen? Is my screen visible?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, okay.
I can see my face, but your screen, it's very odd.
No, I spotlighted your video. So,
Okay.
yeah, it's your day. It's your spotlight. I don't see my...
I am so happy to see everyone's responses. This is so sort of heartening.
Yeah, I am. This is getting
yes, you
messy.
can see in the chat box.
Yeah.
It's like question after question.
The people have been overwhelmed with your lecture.
So we've got a lot of contests coming up. We've got one for doing book reviews. We've not had any participants in so far. So please do send in your entries. It was targeted at college students. We had another one targeted at college students called Forgotten Mumbai, for which we've got quite a lot of interest. This is about doing original research on hidden aspects of the city. And quite a lot of stuff has come to us, so we're very happy. Anjali Kohli will be doing a special session called Masala Trails. And she's going to be talking about unknown spices or little known spices used in the city's cooking. Then our, what do you say, 32 BHP Venkatesh, he will be doing a quiz on the city's heritage, supported by Praveen. He's been buzzing with activity. He is also going to do a very cute little virtual walk called Look Up Mumbai. So instead of looking at the walls and pillars, he's going to ask you to look right up at the roofs and eaves and at the decorations and the statuary that you see right above us. Then we have, in fact, we start the festival with a couple of films on the unknown side of Bombay, the Bombay that we try to ignore as we go about in our daily lives. And there are a few more contests. We've got contests for haiku, we've got contests for photography. Then we have a little activation. So we'd like to know trivia from all of you people about the unknown aspects of Bombay, nostalgia about growing up in Bombay and things that are no longer there, like the video libraries of the 1980s and 90s, for example. And we've got a little promotion called the Zyka Mumbai, which we want to record recipes that are, traditional recipes that were passed down for generations and now kind of at the risk of being lost at the hands of Swiggy and Zomato. Then we're putting together one big anthology of poems on Bombay. And I'm told by Menka Shivdasani, one of the leading city poets, that no one's done an anthology since 1982. So yes, so those of you who have a penchant for verse, please do send us in. We're even planning a treasure hunt if we have the time. We'll probably run it through the night. It's a virtual treasure hunt, so it's going to be on Google Maps. And then we have two very fantastic panel discussions. One on literature and how the city features in the literature of its own, and one on heritage, conservation, and democracy. So the pulls and pressures of conserving our built heritage alongside redeveloping in a city that's so hungry for space. So we're going to have very eminent architects and conservationists have a discussion on that. I'm like going on and on, but yeah, we've got quite the festival. We have two very interesting walks, one on the Pyaus of southern Bombay and one on the two forgotten rivers of Bombay, the Meethi and Dahisar, which we've, they were rivers once upon a time, we've turned them into nalas today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, then we're going to have the story of Mumbai told through various means. So one will be Usha Venkatraman, who's going to do it through puppets. Aditi Mittal is going to do it through stand-up comedy. Manik Premchand will do it through Bollywood songs. And Raman Iyer will do it with his mandolin. So these are story sessions. And I've left the best for last. We're going to have a special keynote address given by the architect Christopher London, who's famous for his book Bombay Gothic. So that's about it. I've taken up quite a bit of time. Let's get back to the questions. So we hope all of you are going to join in this festival very enthusiastically and buy tickets, very cheap tickets, 300 rupees a day, 800 for season pass.
I think Ramesh, people are asking for the Instagram handle to follow all these things. So you can maybe share that.
Yeah, sure. Immediately.
@ Jashan Mumbai.
Jashan Mumbai. JASHN MUMBAI.
Thank you, Ramesh. I hope all of you would participate in our Jashne Mumbai, and it would be a really interesting 3-day program that Mumbai Research Center is organizing. Now we come up to the questions. Actually, Sharon, there are a whole lot of questions, whole lot of comments, and we'll take.
I mean, I've read most of the comments. If anyone has specific questions,
yeah, there is one. Yeah, there is one. There are a few questions.
I would like to clarify. Although I have included certain examples from Calcutta, I have kept the focus to Bombay because this session is called The Story of Bombay, Bombay's early film culture. So the focus is purely Bombay. I am not talking about what was going on in Calcutta film at that time or Calcutta theaters at that time. So wherever there was an interconnect, like with Madan theaters, I have mentioned it, but otherwise, no.
Okay, actually the first question was related to Calcutta.
Exactly.
So maybe we, yes, maybe we go to the, actually there are so many comments, appreciative comments and compliments. I'm sure you read most of them. More than questions, there are.
So if they want to elaborate or.
Yes, some people have raised. Riddhi has Riddhi, I've unmuted you. You can ask your, no, yeah. You may unmute yourself. Riddhi, you have raised your hand. If you've got a question, you may ask it. I've asked you to unmute yourself.
Okay, in the meantime, I'll just answer the question that I see in front of me from Shweta Basu Prasad. My question is, which Parsi performance inspired D.H. Phalke? Is the Latin? So Phalke was inspired by the Obergamo. I'm saying this incredibly wrong because it's a German word I cannot pronounce, but it's the Obergamo Passion Play. And I will sort of type in the link, or you can contact me on Instagram or Facebook and ask the question. These plays were performed in Germany around the time of important Christian holidays like Lent or Easter or Christmas. And so, you know, these plays eventually then started to be filmed. And then one of those films were brought to India, where Christ was dying on the cross and, you know, Mary was weeping over him as his mother. And Phalke felt really moved by it, like the emotion that he saw on the screen. So he said, I also want to do something where the main character goes through trials and tribulations and troubles, and it should move the audience in the same way that I have been moved. He even took his wife to see that passion play cinema thing a second time because his wife remembers, like many years later, she described this. She didn't know what was going on, and he just told her, no, you come and you sit and watch this. And she watched this man dying, and she was completely like, what is going on? And then he brought her out of the cinema hall and said, I want to make something exactly like this. And she was thinking to herself, like, you are mad. This is an actual quote from her. Yeah. I don't have any control over whether the meeting or the recording or whatever is going to be available again. Please stop asking this question. Okay. Agabai, I think, says, I am repeating my question, Irina Glushkova. There was Vernon and Company Photographers and Publishers Company among the photographers in Darbar 1911 official album. It was also in making documentaries in the 1910s. Do you have any information on this form? If they were photographers, I wouldn't have any information on them since I've kept the focus on this entirely to cinema. However, if you want to just like contact me later on my social media, I will try to help you out and figure out where you might get any information on that. I think, what else? Is anyone else? 3 people are raising their hand, but nobody's asking a question.
Ashwini Bhave, I've asked you to unmute yourself. You can unmute yourself and ask your question. Yes, Ashwini Bhave is unmuted.
Hi, this has been, Sharon, this has been incredible because all we think of Dadasaheb Phalke, me being Marathi and from the industry. But I was intrigued by your the information you gave about Pundalik. Can you hear me?
Yeah. There were many
Pundalik,
Marathi
that being, and that name also sounds Maharashtrian, Torne. We had a director, known director, Torne, in my times, even before my times. But I'm curious if you can elaborate on that part. When was that made? How? Okay.
We don't have a lot of biographical information because a lot of these early movies are lost. We can only sort of surmise from descriptions by other people, or as I said, a lot of companies started copying the silent movies that came before during the talkie era. So we can just like surmise from that okay, maybe this is what the original film looks like. But because film is so fragile, it can just burst into flame. It's very fragile. It melts in the heat. It is a very difficult thing to keep safe and preserved for like a vast amount of time. So hats off to everyone who's doing film preservation work because God, it is tough. And in the case of Torne, for example, again, like I said, we can surmise. There is this similar example that I can give you. They say that the Raja Harishchandra that you see attributed to Phalke is actually a later version. I don't know how much of that is true or not. It's an urban legend. So the one that you watch as attributed to Phalke is not actually the Phalke Harishchandra. It is a later version of Harishchandra because, as I said, people were just blatantly copying whatever worked and sort of repeating that formula. So there were many Harishchandras over the years. There were many Indra Sabhas over the years. There were many sort of similar mytho focused.
What I was, can you hear me? What
Yeah.
I was interested in understanding, was there any incident, how far apart Phalke's film and Torne's film were? And was there any sort of Phalke getting inspired by Torne or influenced by his work?
It's only a couple of years, if I recall right, just 2 months. Let me scroll back to the dates so that I don't really get this wrong. Torne was 1912, May 18th. In fact, May was a very important time because that is when even the this thing was screened. The Darbar movie was screened in the UK. But Torne was 1912, and you have Phalke in 1913. So only a year's difference.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Venkatesh. Venkatesh, would you ask your question?
Yes, sure. Firstly, thank you for a fantastic exposition. It was really very insightful. I have two questions. One, could you please share something more on Capitol, the one opposite CST, and its own history? Because we believe that it had a change of name, owners, and how and what. That's question one. And second question I have is on. We hear the name of Brandon, who was associated with the early times with the Royal Opera House and all that. And Brandon is supposed to have had a very successful stint even in Calcutta and stuff like that. The world touring companies of which Brandon was so well known for. Could you please tell us something on Brandon's influence on Mumbai? So there are two questions, one on Capitol and one on Brandon.
Such touring companies. I'll answer the last one first. There were many such touring companies. You had Natak Mandlis who had their own circuits. It depended entirely on where you thought your market was. So it was extremely, extremely fragmented. The market was so precise in terms of we will bring this kind of play or this kind of cinema reel only to this area because it will do well. Because in those days, even transportation and going from place to place was a risk that you were taking. You have this example of a fellow who was sent from England to set up the first theater in Calcutta, and he was supposedly like one very top actor, and he reached Calcutta and he started to fall ill and do poorly, and by the time they sent him around to Bombay to fix up a theater in Bombay, he had died on the journey. So just the act of moving people up and down was a risk that you took. The act of sending reels to a place from a place was a risk that you took. As I said, reels were extremely fragile. And as a theater promoter, you had to know your audience. So whether it's your Bombay circuit, whether it's your South circuit, whether it's your East Calcutta and Bengal circuit, these people were extremely specialized, and they knew exactly where and how and what to do in terms of promotion work. Like, they were extremely knowledgeable about that. Coming to your Capitol Cinema. Capitol Cinema's early name was Gaiety Theatre, and basically it's one of the oldest extant ones. You have it located on the outskirts of the fort, as it was. And Capitol Cinema is the site of usually had a number of English movies and European focused movies, not so much Hindi movies, except in later years. I think I have one booklet from them somewhere. Not really sure. Hang on 1 second. I'll probably post it to you or send it to you later, I guess, because there are so many here. I just don't want to damage any. But yes, Capitol Theatre in my sort of booklets are only associated with English movies. They don't really feature Hindi movies all that much. So these were movies that were brought over by American production houses from the States, a lot of Universal films. Well, this one's from the Excelsior. I don't know if you can see this. And this one's from the Excelsior, and guess what? This one is blackface.
Awesome.
Yeah, you very much had like audiences enjoying and approving, and it says right here, you know, the first all talking motion picture, and then they have these extremely racist phrases like surrounding their mouths over here, which like I'll maybe make a post of, but it's kind of disturbing that these exist. Like this, there were things like this that were shown at Capitol also. So it's the same sort of kind of films that were shown. This was at the Royal Opera House, if you can see. It says Warner Brothers presents Husbands for Rent at the Royal Opera House, Saturday, April.
Amazing.
Right. Yeah.
Amazing.
So these English movies were targeted to very specific theaters, and the native town theaters, quote unquote native town, because there was this idea that only the theaters in native town would show Indian sort of plays and performances and cinema reels, but they also showed a lot of European performers, and a lot of Europeans went there also to access like restaurants and cafes and the red light district. So all these things were sort of located within proximity to each other. That was the appeal of the native town theaters. These European theaters, as they are called, which Capitol was, showed these sort of quote unquote family friendly movies. A lot of very unusual ticket design. This is a later design for a spoof of, this is like a spoof movie of All Quiet on the Western Front, but it says Not So Quiet on the Western Front. It has this unusual like cutout shape design, you know, and this is at the back. And so this was meant to like directly grab attention if you were a customer or if you were passing by on the street. Let me show you one more, then we'll probably call it a day, I think. One is the no longer existing Pathé Cinema at Lamington Road. So as I said, even though they were technically located in native town, they showed the European movies also for European performances, but they were mostly like slapstick and or like romance kind of movies, not really sort of highbrow movies. I don't know what you would call highbrow, but this was the kind of stuff that was being brought to India at that time.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. And there's a request from one of the participants, Nandini. She says, please digitize all the material that you have. And of course, we also look forward to the exhibition which we may have in the future at Asiatic Society. On behalf of Mumbai Research Center, Asiatic Society of Mumbai, I would like to thank you for delivering a wonderful lecture and making it a very good evening for all of us. Thank you very much.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much.
And thank you, participants, for attending this. And for the beautiful comments that you have made. This has made our lecture more and more interesting. Thank you
If you
so
have
much.
any more questions, because I see some hands are still raised or whatever, just get in touch with me on socials. I'll probably answer you there. All right. So contact me on my
Thank
social.
you. Thank you so much, Sharon. Thank you. Looking forward to many more associations with you.